Hey, it's Decatur from Super Politics Show. You're probably wondering why I'm here without Steve. That's because he didn't want to do this, even though he told me to do it. He wanted me to let you know to follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/SteveAndDecatur. That's twitter.com/SteveAndDecatur. And while you're at it, why don't you go follow us on our Patreon, which is patreon.com/SuperPoliticsShow.
And that's when we started getting real philosophical.
Oh yeah.
You don't know the art we're trying to spit out right now. Art we're trying to spit out right now.
And we're here to say, fuck your liberal, huh? Fuck your liberal, huh? You're upset that we went to Iraq for oil? Well, too bad.
Take a look at your ass. You shouldn't be able to see it that easy.
How it works, lefties have something. And we're on.
We're going to do this great interview with Micah Uetricht, and he is the deputy editor of Jacobin magazine, which is a leftist magazine publication, and really, really good, and everyone should subscribe. He also, more importantly, is the author of a book, the co-author of a book called Bigger Than Bernie. What the book is about, and what we're also talking about in today's episode, is, as you know, Decatur and I are both really big Bernie supporters. Bernie is no longer in the race for 2016 or 2020. Yeah, I know, big news. And so the question then is, what do we do if these ideas that Bernie were pushing was not just his ideas. It fundamentally requires a mass movement of people to support it. How do we get that?
Right.
And how do we actually make essentially democratic socialism or something like that, whatever kind of attracted you to Bernie? How do we get to a place where that is the law of the land and that's the country we live in? These big dreams, Medicare for all, whatever. What else did Bernie talk about? That's the only one anyone ever brings up.
Never talk about anything else.
That was the only issue. No, but
Green New Deal, all those sort of things, and
all the big social programs.
And Steve, it is kind of funny to just, for anyone listening around the world, and we talk about these big crazy ideas like healthcare for everyone sounds pretty silly because it's the rest of the world is doing it, except
no, I mean, that's so fucking sad, right? We literally are like the only country who doesn't have it, and then when you talk to other people in the rest of the world, like you just said, they're like, why are you politicians talking about it like it's this crazy idea? Why?
Instead, we're talking about stock bumps. What to do with them? I
mean, for real. And think about the solution for Medicare for all. Instead of Medicare for all, they have now Obamacare forces you to participate in a private market by threat of penalizing you. I mean, this is how it used to work. Right. And then the federal courts invalidated the individual mandate. But the idea was that you will be fined for not participating in the capitalist market. That is not what we're going for, people. And so, but that a lot of people, millions and millions of people were inspired by Bernie. And it just kind of seemed like, oh shit, now what do we do? Right. And this book, Bigger Than Bernie, talks about it. And it's not just this book talks about ideas that a lot of people have been discussing on basically what are the key things that we need to do to build this movement. And really, as we're going to talk about with Micah in this interview, is it kind of boils down to maybe two major ideas. One is we need to get politically organized. I mean, that really is the whole idea, but there's multiple ways to do that. So one way to do that is to join political organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America, who have spiked in membership. Decatur and I are both members, and they're doing really awesome work in not just keeping the message of Bernie alive, but pushing it way further than Bernie ever would have. Really talking to people about what was behind Bernie's message? What was this about? Right. And what is this whole complaint about capitalism? Why does Bernie call himself a socialist? What is all this shit? The DSA is doing great work on teaching people that stuff and getting people involved in what really has been an international movement for over 100 years now of really, I mean, longer than that, but practically speaking, of people throughout the world trying to move on to something better than capitalism. And even if you're not trying to get us past capitalism, just how do we get to a place where we're not just being completely exploited and getting nothing in return?
Right. And I mean, listen, I think regardless, even Micah would agree. I mean, this is going to be a step by step. We're not just going to be able to take one big leap and get to this socialist utopia that we would all like to live in. So it's going to take a lot of steps, and we are probably going to get into that a little too. Just listen, no one's happy or pumped for Joe Biden, but that's the reality of it. I think this interview comes at a perfect time with everything going on right now with the Noam Chomsky interview that went viral on the Bad Faith podcast, kind of refusing the idea of not voting for Biden and why it's a bad idea. And it's a big topic. So like, I think that we can,
I'm going to put that podcast episode in the description here. So everyone should check that out.
Definitely. But I think that for me personally, this Bigger Than Bernie book can really be helpful if you're one of those people like me who are biting their fucking tongue going in there, having to vote for Joe Biden, miserable about it, but you have to do it. Reading a book like this really does give you here's some opportunity for the future, and here are the steps that we need to take. And like, right. And I think that definitely to help mobilize, some more people. I actually just saw, speaking of this, I just saw a really good ad today from the Justice Democrats that pretty much was straight up like, listen, I don't like Joe Biden. I don't like either of the candidates, but I'm voting for Joe Biden. And I think that's kind of the sentiment here is like, we want Joe Biden to win so the left can continually get more seats and grow. We're not going to have that if we're stomped out by the Trump administration.
I mean, just to be clear, we've talked about this on the podcast, like maybe every episode recently, but like the difference I'm so sick of QAnon. Let me tell you what that is. I do that every episode. So anyway, I'm not going to talk about QAnon right now. I'm going to talk about like literally, we are obviously well aware as people on the left of like the horrible death count that neoliberal politics has. And by neoliberal, I mean people who represent the ideology of Joe Biden. Right. So people who think and act like Joe Biden, who want to make everything about, making sure that we're first and foremost taking care of the rich people and everything else is second to that. That's kind of neoliberal politics in a nutshell, in a way. So from that you get, okay, let's go to Iraq and get all the oil. Let's go to, let's do everything we can to quash any type of popular movement, because all of this is like our first and foremost loyalty is the rich. And then any little pittance we give you, like any little social service we might award you to like keep you calm, is literally like probably only there designed to like stop us from fucking rebelling or some shit.
Sure,
I mean that's probably the argument.
Which is a real fucking thing. It's like, I mean, even you look at, the worst conditions of workers across the world, and they get paid pennies, but they'll give them, whether it's housing or something like that, or a discount here and there. That's how neoliberalism really works. And capitalism is like, how far can we stretch, these people's tolerance?
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just think that it's, it's amazing what people will put up with just to get by and live the day-to-day life, because people at the end of the day just want to figure out what snacks they're going to buy at the grocery store. That's really what it comes down to. So not everyone's going to have time to fight back at the system. So I think that, that's another reason, we'll get into all that. But.
Well, I mean, I'll never forget, my wife got back from India and she went and spoke with people who worked in factories there. And some of them have, of course, really, really terrible working conditions. And one of the things she learned and kind of brought home and talked to me about was like, the reality is a lot of these people are grateful to work in the factory. Now, that is not because like the factory is a good thing. It's because that's exactly how neoliberal politics works. It's like you make the horrible exploitative working conditions and very extremely, I mean, these people still lived in shacks, right? But it's like they just make it the bare minimum better than complete fucking poverty and destitution. And that's like how this works, is like they compare it to what is the alternative. And in the United States, the alternative is like, well, I go on welfare for a while I have to find a job and I'm completely fucked and I don't really have good medical care, if any, and I might end up on the street realistically, like all these things. And they're like horrible. What happens to you if you can't work in the United States? In India, it's also really, really bad, but like the bar has moved to even worse in some places. So they in India have set this bar so low that they're able to get away with paying people even less in the United States and treating them even worse, because like they're literally grateful just not to be on the street. And like that that to me like sums up the whole system. Is like, we call this whole system like voluntary, but the reality is like it's only voluntary in like a theoretical sense, but in a practical sense, if the alternative is suffering and desperation, it's not voluntary at all.
Well, and I think it's a really good example that you point to other countries, because I think sometimes, you know, Americans can be so stubborn looking at ourselves where we don't really realize all the, you know, pitfalls of capitalism. But if you don't want to look at the obvious failures of capitalism in America, like the Flint water crisis, you know, going down to just union busting, you know, fucking Paul Ryan, all those guys, and Scott Walker and all them, then look around the world. I mean, like, places aren't doing well, and it's not because of socialism. It's because of capitalist policies that have just fucked their nations over. It's capitalism and nationalism.
Yeah. And so like, you know, and this is actually related to the interview, believe it or not. And that's that, like, a lot of what you see, a lot of the better working conditions that we do have in the United States compared to some other countries, not all, a lot of countries have much better work life than ours, significantly in a lot of ways. And but what we do have here, and we should be grateful for, was hard fought by the labor movement and by leftists and by people like, you know, probably the people listening to this podcast who like believe in the power of unions and believe in the power of like political action, that like fought their ass off for that stuff. But we're still so far away from like what even other countries have compared to like how life could be so much better that Bernie would talk about all the time. It's like, don't tell me that we can't have nice things. There's other countries that do, you know, and like, and there's I'm not going to get into all the counter arguments about that because most of them are ridiculous. All I'm going to say is that if you were sold on that message, which we were, obviously, then there's multiple things we want to talk to Micah about in this interview, about like, how do we not just keep that momentum going, but really get this movement to the point that it's the majority of people in the United States agree with it, and that they say enough is enough. It's time for something better. But what do we have to do? What steps do we have to take to actually get there? And one of the questions we have right now, like in a few weeks, is who the fuck do I vote for in 2020? Right. And so we're going to talk about that, and we're going to give our take. And who the fuck cares if you agree with us? Like, I'm not here to judge you if you think that we're wrong on our take. It's a strategic disagreement.
I'm here to, I don't give a fuck. I'll judge, dude. You know, like, what happened to just judging people? But yeah, no, we're going to get into all that. And listen, I mean, I don't think anyone's surprised that we're going to have that conversation, Steve. I mean, it's a crazy year.
It's coming up. It's coming up to the election. So we just wanted to talk to you about like the third party movement. We wanted to talk about, you know, the other political organizing that can be done. What should people like Bernie Sanders supporters or DSA members or leftists or whatever progressives be doing in response to like Joe Biden being a terrible option, but Trump being a worse option? I mean, objectively. And then, you know, what do we do about that? And then what do we do going forward? And that's going to be the conversation. And we're super excited to have Micah on. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you know, never. You finish.
No, I was just going to say the co-author of the book Bigger Than Bernie is Megan Day. And they did a really kick-ass job on this book. So I'm really excited to talk to Micah about it.
So that being said, Micah Uetricht, here in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Thanks again, Micah, for coming on the show. Just for our listeners who are watching the video, here's the book he co-authored with Megan Day. Really great book for a lot of the listeners on our show. We're Bernie Sanders supporters, still are. And like a lot of us, we feel, you know, really let down by what happened both in 2016 and in 2020. But the reality is that we're now talking about socialism, and our movement exists in a way that it never has before. And that's really exciting. So the question that Micah, your book is about, and also what we want to talk to you about now, is like, where do we go from here? Maybe just to kick things off, though, maybe we should just start with this election right now. For people who are supporters of Bernie Sanders, I mean, can I ask you, what is your take on like what, you know, people are talking a lot about third parties. People are talking about a lot of different things. And what do you think that how you vote on this particular election is relevant to the larger democratic socialist movement?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
That's a very tricky question that you just put forward there. So I was an elected delegate to the Democratic Socialists of America 2019 convention, and I voted yes on the resolution that's now called Bernie or Bust, which was a resolution that said that the DSA would not support anybody besides Bernie Sanders in the presidential race. And I agree. I still believe that was the right vote. I'm glad that we passed that. DSA has to represent a kind of politics that are independent of certainly the mainstream Democratic Party, figures like Joe Biden. We don't represent a lesser evilism. We represent a qualitatively different kind of politics, and we should stick by that.
I agree with that. Yeah.
On the other hand, I have been a little, I don't know, scared straight recently by seeing Trump just drift in increasingly reactionary, anti-democratic, violent directions that seem to indicate that he has no scruples about violating basic democratic process, even to the extent that he might be willing to try to attempt a kind of coup to stay in office, or certainly use the many anti-democratic means he has at his disposal, from the Electoral College, huge problem in itself, to openly praising measures to suppress the vote. The thing that, it's just another example, but a thing I found so disturbing in the last 24 hours is this example out of California, where the Republican Party, I believe in Los Angeles, has put out these fake ballot boxes, a drop-off box for your ballots, to openly, brazenly steal people's official ballots.
Yeah.
And Trump is praising them doing this. Yeah. And they're in court. Those Republicans are in court fighting the court, trying to say, no, you can't steal people's ballots.
Why is this an argument? It didn't. Yeah.
So, and those are just minor. I mean, there's just example after example of things like that show his willingness to engage in that kind of thing. And then, the way in which our politics have become increasingly detached from reality. I mean, most obviously through things like Q, or I remember seeing a poll maybe a month or two ago that the poll said, number of coronavirus deaths under Donald Trump, acceptable or unacceptable? And I forget the exact number, but there was a solid majority of Republicans who said acceptable.
Wow.
Let the bodies pile to the high heavens. Like, that's fine. And so I'm like, how do we can't do socialism under these conditions. We can't advance a real class politics when we have to insist to people that 200,000 or 400,000 or 2 million people, in fact, should not die, do not need to die.
Right.
And we have a sizable minority, but an important minority of the population saying, no, kill them all. Just let them go.
Yeah.
They're like,
or arguably worse, maybe not worse, but like on the same spectrum, is a huge percent of them don't even believe that number is real. I mean, that's another problem with all the conspiracy theories going around right now.
Well, yeah, and I mean, speaking of conspiracies, we saw Trump, I think it was yesterday, retweet someone saying that the Bin Laden death was a hoax. So, I mean, like, it's kind of tough as people on the left. We have to end up defending for these, neoliberal centrists all year round just because of all the lies. And I feel like it definitely deters the movement of growing the left. But
yeah, so there's all that going on, plus the fact that I have become increasingly worried about, and hopefully I'll be proven wrong about this, but clearly in the last months of the campaign, he's really gone all in on a kind of Red Scare rhetoric. He's talking about Marxists. They're talking about socialism at the RNC. One of his sons is launching a bus tour that's like a Fighters Against Socialism tour. So Trump, he has the attention span of a goldfish. So I don't know if he could actually pull off a 21st century Red Scare, like a real one, like a reboot of McCarthyism in the 21st century. But what I think is more worrisome is like the combination of the violent rhetoric and the encouragement of like white supremacists in the street and far right elements in the streets, combined with his anti-socialist rhetoric, will result in addition to all the bad stuff, the xenophobia and everything else we know so awful about him, will also result in like more leftists getting gunned down at protests, or more legal repressive matters being meted out against leftists. So, as things have heated up in the campaign, I've just become increasingly worried about what a Trump second term would look like. And I have, more fervently than ever want to see him defeated. I don't think that socialists should give our official imprimatur, our stamp of approval on somebody like Joe Biden. But I haven't gone on the phone for Biden yet, but I'm kind of ready to do it, just because it's hard to imagine any kind of left politics really flourishing in these conditions.
Well, as we know historically, in full on fascist nations, which we've had an episode about, we're on the road. I don't think we can identify as a fascist nation quite at this point, but the more right wing and authoritarian countries become, the first thing they stamp out is leftists. So, I mean, I think I agree with your answer completely. Is the more kind of radical the right becomes, the more that becomes the immediate threat. And we have to do something about that right now. So, I mean, we've been vocal about that too. As much as we want democratic socialism, we got to work within the power structure that currently exists to kind of get rid of the imminent threat of Trump, who, has already proven himself to disregard human life and the working class. So I agree and appreciate those sentiments completely. Feel free to cut in any time, Decatur. I did have another question. Unless you had a question right now.
No, you go for it.
Okay, yeah, just jump in whenever. I talk a lot. So we've seen a lot of third-party discussion, and in particular the People's Party, and how it looks like the People's Party. I mean, I'm obviously down for it in theory. The idea of having you talked about in your book, we need an actual kind of labor party. We need some, leftist / progressive actual party working for the working class. The problem, of course, is what we talked about with the current 2020 election. And I fear that although the People's Party is talking about this is for after the 2020 election, you see a lot of its major supporters out there telling people don't vote for Joe Biden. And I mean, I think you kind of already answered the question on that, but I do kind of want to see what your take is. Do you think that the People's Party might be the answer either now or going forward as far as leftist politics and building power?
Well, to be honest, I haven't followed what's going on with the People's Party specifically very closely, but in general, this problem that we lay out in the book is one that has bedeviled the American left for, more than a century, which is that we're stuck with these two parties, and people who get behind efforts like the People's Party or the Green Party are correct in saying the Democrats are not cutting it. This is not a real left-wing party. They clearly can't be trusted to, be a standard bearer for anti-corporate politics. They can't even succeed on their own terms of defeating the worst of right-wing reactionary politics, right? I mean, the whole reason for voting for Hillary Clinton in 2016, we were told, was that, Trump is so much worse and she'll at least be able to beat. She's at least the electable candidate over Trump. And of course, the electable candidate was not elected. So, it's a real issue, a real problem that folks who get behind third party efforts right now are identifying that we're stuck with these awful Democrats. But we can't just be sort of moral about how we go about choosing whether or not we're going to, back a third party effort or back the Democrats. It's not much about morality. It's about strategy. And it's very clear from the last several decades, for example, that on the whole, third party candidacies don't really go anywhere in America. And that's not for any fault of the third party backers themselves. It's because we live in this uniquely undemocratic country that seeks to snuff out third parties of any kind and preserves this kind of two-party duopoly of our political system. So secondly, in addition to that, you can't just sort of call for a party and sort of will it into existence. I mean, it can't just be a grouping of sort of concerned citizens with no real mass base. Most importantly for the left, with no base in the labor movement, which certainly such a party does not have yet. We have to build towards that kind of thing. So the strategy that we lay out in the book is one that maybe we'll get into more. It's called the dirty break, where we sort of say that yes, the long-term goal is to create a workers' party, a social democratic party, a socialist party, some kind of real left-wing party in American politics that is distinct from the Democrats. But we're not going to have that tomorrow because of the structural barriers that we're up against. And so, ironically, the path the path beyond the Democratic Party actually goes through the Democratic Party. And we've seen that in how people have used Democratic candidacies, like most importantly Bernie Sanders. And I think we just have to understand that this presidential election is not going to be the time in which a third party candidacy becomes credible and then helps us lead to that independent third party that we all want. I mean, we're stuck with Joe Biden for now. I hate to inform people that this is just the reality, and we're not going to get beyond that morass in the next month or whatever.
Yeah, I'm curious too if you think, is a dirty break possible without kind of should we focus more on ranked choice voting in the meanwhile? Obviously a dirty break is possible down the line, but do you think that should be the main concern of leftists right now is kind of, because I do see there's, even Ben Shapiro called for ranked choice voting. And I'm is that something that we can get on a mainstream level, more popular before a dirty break possibly?
Well, whatever we do, we should not be with Ben Shapiro, handed.
No, sure.
No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, definitely not. No,
doing rallies.
Just as a warning to your listeners.
Yeah,
please, no rallies with Ben Shapiro.
No.
We are not an intellectual dark web podcast. I promise.
I don't speak fast enough to be a part of Ben Shapiro's clique.
Yeah, that's true.
No, clearly those kind of, in order for any kind of dirty break to eventually happen, you can't just will it into being. There are a number of steps that need to take place before such a thing would ever be possible. One of which is significant political reforms to our undemocratic political system. Things like ranked choice voting would obviously have to be instituted. And we argue this all the time at Jacobin, that socialists really should be at the forefront of those kinds of campaigns. Yeah. It's kind of weird because normally we associate those kind of reforms to voting or whatever with Democrats, because Republicans are always trying to suppress the vote, and so Democrats are saying no, don't suppress the vote, and we're okay, well, don't suppress the vote, but if we engage in this campaign, that means that more people get to vote for Joe Biden, who we don't really like very much. But it is really important on a principled sort of small d democratic level that we be at the forefront for those kind of democratic reforms. They're desperately needed in this society, but they also are not the only thing that is needed in order to build the kind of party, to execute a dirty break strategy. We also need people. We need to build a real base. I think that's what actually groups like the DSA are doing a better job of than we're not quite on the front line of leading democratic reforms, but we are on the front line of building ties with the labor movement, building ties with really important activist groups like the Sunrise Movement and other groups who, if we were ever to create a real third party, they would have to be a part of our coalition. Right. So we're doing that stuff, and neither the democratic reforms or that building of a real base is more important than the other. We need to be doing both.
To me, that's the key disconnect that I hear from people advocating for third parties, or if you want to go real wild, the people advocating for revolution or whatever. The key disconnect for anybody who's talking about something other than the dirty break, in my opinion, is that they don't understand that we don't have the mass support yet. And none of these ideas work without people who actually agree with our fucking politics. Unless they're on our side, what do we have? And I think that's really key. Another point I wanted to highlight that you just brought up, maybe talk about a little bit more, is that the labor movement. I think that the labor movement is an example. Decatur and I were just talking about this right before the show, is that that's an example where the left can have real tangible power, actual ability to directly confront the capitalist class and advocate for workers and for better lives for all of us, without even going through the political system. And so to me, I think part of the importance of what you're talking about here, not just trying to get, a lot of people will shit on our idea of trying to get socialists in office, oh, they'll never hold real power. It's yeah, but we have those kind of allies in office, and think about what it can do for the labor movement and what we can do for the labor movement if we wake more people up to the need for it, right? People don't an awareness of the need for a labor movement in this country right now is completely dead. In my opinion, there's some in Las Vegas We're lucky on that. But like the labor movement,
I mean, even then, they have pretty much all supported Warren's campaign. So I mean, like, I think that there's a misdirection of what the Labor Party wants and needs. But,
yeah.
Well,
I saw you
I
like
think,
somewhat disagree. You seem like you think there's maybe a bigger labor movement than I realize.
Well, all I was disagreeing with is that that there are stirrings that are extremely extremely heartening in much of the labor movement. Obviously the teacher strike wave, for example, or some of the other kind of organizing that has come out of the last couple of years, which, by the way, DSA has often played, as you all know, in a place like Las Vegas, right? I mean, DSA has played key roles in some of these fights, either as outside supporters or sometimes as some of the key organizers who are organizing for these strikes. But on the bigger point, I mean, we also write in the book, there's a section about Chicago that I wrote, because I live in Chicago, and somebody asked me on a call, a DSA call that I did, that Megan and I did, my co-author, about how to create more AOCs. That was just the question. It's like, how do we create more AOCs? And I was like, well, that's a good question. But exactly. Yeah. Well, so that's the kind of implication, right? Like what ingredients do we need to piece together to create this new? And that's a fair question. But the way I answered that question was to tell the story of Chicago, in which Chicago has half a dozen DSA members on its city council, as hopefully your listeners are aware of, and it's pretty great, and they've done really amazing things. And the reason that those half a dozen people are on the city council is not because Chicago DSA is uniquely amazing, although I would argue that it is. It's not because we found that special formula to create these people in a lab. It's because in Chicago, the political landscape has been transformed by the Chicago Teachers Union. And the Chicago Teachers Union, a decade ago this year, a new left-wing Democratic, small-d Democratic reform leadership took over the union. They won an election, and they took over the union, and then they turned it into the Chicago Teachers Union that we know and love today, which is one that is democratic, that's militant, that goes on strike, etc. They're also the anchor of a new left wing of politics in this city, and they have changed the political landscape of Chicago. Like, there are the sort of neoliberal Democrats over here, and then there's the Chicago Teachers Union and everybody who's allied with them over here. Now, I bring this up to say that happened because a pretty small group, this was my first book. I wrote a book about the Chicago Teachers Union, about the backstory to their 2012 strike, how it came about. It was just, a dozen or so, 15 people, some of whom were socialists, most of whom were not, who were sick and tired of the way their union was failing to rise to the challenge of attacks on public education. And they're the ones who took over the union, and then everything flowed from that. So that's a long way of saying that if you want more AOCs, you should organize a union, and you should get involved in existing unions, because that is the kind of power that unions at their best can have, that they not only are able to go on strike and wrest concessions out of their bosses, they're also able to change the entire political weather of a city. And so that is why it's so essential for socialists to be deeply involved in the labor movement, because incredible things can come out of that involvement. That has to be a central task going forward for the DSA and for anybody else who wants to see a revival of left-wing politics in this country.
Yeah, I think that coupled with the dirty break strategy seems to be the best way to really get us on the map. And to talk a little bit more about the union thing, I one thing that I think should be obvious to a lot of our listeners, but just to ask the question anyway, is that what do you think the problem is with most unions? And I'll just give you a tangible example you might not have experience with, but the culinary union is a huge union here in Las Vegas and endorsed anybody but Bernie. That's what they said. And their argument was, which I find preposterous, was you're going to lose your healthcare plan that we provide as your union overlords, that if Bernie comes along and gives a single payer healthcare. So, I just want to, how does that happen where a union should be a radical leftist hub?
Yeah, this is a key question for people to understand. I think a lot of people who maybe don't have much of a background in left-wing politics or in the labor movement get into DSA, and they start learning about left-wing politics, and they hear like, oh, unions are really important, unions are really good, and they're like, okay, yeah, unions. And then they look at the culinary doing what they did to Bernie, and they're like, wait, what the fuck, I thought unions were good, like now they're bad. No, not fuck unions, I hate unions. And the reason that things like the culinary thing happen is they're part of the structural pressures that unions face under capitalism. The left-wing union organizer and researcher and writer Sam Gindin has always made the argument that we need to have a left that has both one foot in and one foot out of the labor movement. And you need to have one foot out of the labor movement because if you have both feet in the labor movement, then you become subject to the pressures that the labor movement is subject to under capitalism. So let's, for an example of this, let's think of the culinary, because what they said about their healthcare plan is not wrong. We live in a country, as everybody knows, that doesn't have a national health system like every other wealthy country in the world. And so working class people who do have decent healthcare, by and large, are members of unions. Their unions, in some cases, in the case of the culinary in Las Vegas, literally like fought and sometimes died to win the kind of robust benefits and good pay that they have. And that is that just like we can't say we can't downplay that. Like that's incredible, right? Like they went toe to toe with the capitalist class and they wrung these concessions out of them, and that's incredible. But what that also means is that so you win good healthcare, let's say. Well, now your union is in charge of your healthcare plan. That's good. You're getting a good healthcare plan, but that also means that your union now has a structural incentive because your union's in charge of like literally billions of dollars worth of a healthcare plan for you. So what does that do to an institution that is in charge of that amount of money? Well, it pulls them in a conservatizing direction because they're like, well, maybe it would be good to go out on a limb and support Bernie Sanders, or maybe it would be good to engage in a strike that might be technically considered illegal because our boss is acting a fool. But wait a minute, we have these billions of dollars in assets and tens of thousands of people's real healthcare plans that we're in charge of. So that pulls you in a conservatizing direction. So of course, I was disgusted by what the culinary did, but we have to understand that their actions come from these sort of structural incentives and structural pressures on the labor movement. And how do you overcome those structural pressures? Well, you do it in the same way that I described what was happening in the Chicago Teachers Union. I mean, the Chicago Teachers Union, the radicals who took over in 2010, the leadership that they were taking over from and that they were dissatisfied with, it's not like they were uniquely evil people. I mean, maybe they were kind of like lazy and they wanted to pay themselves big salaries, but they weren't evil. And if you talk to them, they would say that they like actually believe in trade union rights or whatever. But the structural pressures of the office pulled them rightward, and so you needed a group of people who could who both had good politics, socialists and non-socialists who had good politics, and then also like institutional mechanisms within the union to make sure that when those structural pressures come to bear on you, that you don't get pulled rightward. So that is a central task for socialists, not just to organize unions, not just to help people, help lead strikes, but to figure out how to overcome the kind of structural pressures that pull unions like the culinary in the direction of opposing a Bernie Sanders. And that's obviously that's such a key question, because as we just said, you can't build the kind of party that we all agree is desperately needed. You can't build the kind of left-wing politics as a whole in society without labor. But you can't just labor won't get on board for that kind of left-wing project if it's allowed to be pulled in these conservatizing directions.
Yeah. So I mean, to me, making sure the unions are run in a democratic way, for example, seems like a key structural change that can happen to unions. So it's not just like run by administrative fiat by whoever are the labor organizers or administrators. So I agree with that. And so, and that's something we plan to talk about on our show more, is how important the labor movement is for the left. But specifically about your current book, Bigger Than Bernie, and you talk a lot about the dirty break. I would definitely consider you a leader on that strategy, on talking about that strategy. So one of the really important things about this, I think, is just looking at empirical data, which you spend a lot of time in your book talking about, is like, let's look at how all these third-party efforts actually what did they do for us throughout, American history, and then compare it to what Bernie Sanders just did for the last two general elections or primary elections, and how now all of a sudden there's a billion podcasts like ours talking about socialism and people wanting to know more about it, buying your book, trying to figure out, okay, yeah, I never even knew about democratic socialism. How do we get this to happen? That's just a reality that I think has never happened in this country. And it just empirically proves like the wisdom of using the existing power structures that we have, including the Democratic Party, to primary on. So I don't know if you want to talk more about the strategy and how it works in practice specifically.
Yeah, I would make clear that it's not like third-party efforts throughout American history are all total failures. I mean, Bernie himself talks about in one of his books, like he has no regrets for as running in his third-party candidacy in Vermont before he won the mayorship of Burlington, because his candidacies put important issues on the agenda that then Democrats had to carry out, even though he got less than 10% of the vote. But yes, on the whole, like certainly two campaigns like Bernie's party show the power of that kind of strategy of using the Democratic Party ballot line. I mean, as I was saying before, there's these sort of like key problem of leftists throughout American political history is that people have recognized what's wrong with the Democratic Party, and they say, okay, I'm just done with the Democratic Party. I'm going to create a third party, or I'm going to get involved in a third party campaign. And they haven't really gone anywhere for the most part. Right. Other people who are good progressives, good leftists say, okay, I understand the Democratic Party sucks, but it's the only game in town. So I'm just going to go into it and to try to get things done. And there's a long history as well of leftists who do that being pulled rightward, adopting the kind of neoliberal politics of the Democratic Party. Even when they don't fully adopt those politics, their politics get watered down. And so the dirty break strategy, which I maybe this is not a wise thing to say as the author of a book. I should probably accept your praise of me and Megan as being like key thinkers. We're like thought leaders on the dirty break strategy.
Yes.
But the truth is, if you read the book closely, you realize that we basically just stole those ideas from other people who've written for Jacobin, like Eric.
Great
Blanc.
Artists steal. That's how it works.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah,
Eric
just
Blanc
take the credit, damn it.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I'll give a nod to Eric Blanc, who coined the term, and Seth Ackerman, who also has written a lot about these kind of issues, and Paul Heidemann, whose Jacobin essays are really where we got this stuff from.
Sure.
But so the dirty break strategy acknowledges the need to get beyond the Democratic Party, but says that the best way to do that is through the Democratic Party, running on the Democratic Party ballot line, but also heightening the contradictions between the Democratic Party leadership and its base. And I think this is a key thing for socialists to understand, because like there's a shorthand where people are like, I hate the Democrats, But when you say that, a lot of people, average Democratic voters, think that means that you hate them. But the constituency of the Democratic Party, like its base, is good. That should be the base of a real left-wing party, right? Like union members, African Americans, civil rights activists, environmental activists, feminists, like all those people should be the base of a real left-wing party in this country. So we have to make careful distinctions between that base and the Nancy Pelosi's and the Chuck Schumers. But we need to go toe-to-toe with the Nancy Pelosi's and the Chuck Schumers, because they are the ones who are the Democratic Party power brokers who are going to do everything in their power to stop a real left-wing agenda from emerging within the Democratic Party, the Joe Bidens as well, we should say. Right. So the idea is to sort of, as I said, heighten the contradictions between that working class base of the party and the sort of donor class and the neoliberal centrist democratic types who are getting money from Wall Street and Blue Cross Blue Shield and everybody else. And the hope is that eventually someday, in the long term, that we would be able to break from that party. Now, this is not a strategy that, for example, Bernie or AOC embrace. They rhetorically make gestures more towards like AOC is always saying, like, I'm the real Democratic Party, basically. Like I'm going to take it from the people who don't actually represent what the Democratic Party is about, or they want to move the Democratic Party leftward. It's often called realignment, in that you sort of push out the reactionary elements of the party, and then it becomes more of a genuine left-wing party. Now, I have some doubts about that actually happening in the long term because there are some real structural barriers to that. But AOC is also doing things like saying, you remember earlier this year, a journalist was asking her about Biden, and she stopped him and was like, just so you understand, if me and Joe Biden were in a different country, we would not be in the same party. Yeah. And when she says stuff like that, I think for millions of people or large numbers of people, they hear that and they're like, oh, I had never really considered that. Like maybe there could be some kind of alternative political arrangement. Or Bernie's campaigns, right? Through both campaigns, we saw like what this is a guy who he was not arguing for the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? He was like, let's get some health care, let's get some like free college for students, like let's do some very basic things. And then the Nancy Pelosi's and Chuck Schumer's of the world moved heaven and earth to destroy him. So I think that raises the question for a lot of people, especially young people, what is this party all about? What I thought this was the left-wing party, and yet this is how they're treating a candidate who's asking for very basic things. So I bring that up to say that even if they're not, even if Bernie or AOC are not sort of advocates of the dirty break strategy, I think that what they have done in their time campaigning and in office has really helped ratchet up those tensions with the party, which are essential, you know, whether we ever break from the Democrats or not. Like having that kind of head-to-head fight with the reactionary neoliberal elements of the party is absolutely essential. That's the only way for us to get nice things.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious too. I've seen, I guess this is a two-part question here. I've seen more and more talk online talking about that. Not only should we be trying to infiltrate the Democratic Party, but in more, I guess, like Midwestern areas where unions are like a thing, like, you know, like certain parts of like Oklahoma or Kansas where the Democratic name is just completely tarnished. Do you think there's any worth in like leftists like trying to kind of hack into that system, or is that just too far-fetched, do you think?
What do you mean, like run as Republicans?
Yeah.
Well, I think on paper that is something that could be possible. In practice, it's hard to imagine. I mean, what is, I think, in the kind of places that you're talking about, what I think is a better strategy would just be like a very clear indicator that you know, maybe you run as a Democrat, but you're like, I am disgusted with the way that this party has sold out people in states like Oklahoma, has sold out the working class. You know, you make that a very central part of your brand, right? Like you very clearly articulate what's wrong with this party. This party is not the party that represents people like me or people like you, right? I think that's probably a more fruitful strategy. I mean, in theory, you know, Seth Ackerman, who wrote the article Blueprint for a New Party, which is where we take a lot of this stuff from, he says that such a thing could be possible because the argument is that these are not traditional parties in the sense that every other country has. Like these aren't real parties. You know, you can't really be a member of them, and nothing is really asked of you. I mean, people have some attachment to like being labeled as a Democrat or Republican, but like that means a very different thing if you're like a member of the Labour Party in the UK, for example. Like that it means a lot more to be a Labour Party member. So like these are much more empty vessels, or maybe not empty vessels, but just it's just a name that people attach to themselves, and so you can sort of do stuff with that. I mean, I'm open to be proven wrong if someone can bring me a situation in which they're like, no, this is where it makes sense to run as a Republican.
I'm going to change my name to Mitt Romney and do it. No.
Well, you know, it might make sense if you were like in a small town where the election for mayor or whatever, city council, where, you know, it's not that many votes and you can kind of like meet most of the voters and be like, yeah, I'm running as a Republican, but just because this other route is closed to me, I think you could make.
Well, and I think that's kind of what I'm talking about. Like, I mean, there's districts in, you know, Kansas down to like Arkansas, the whole Sun Belt even. It's just like they'll never vote for a Democrat no matter what. And it is just an attachment in a word. But if you look at just how the average person is thinking of politics, you know, I think we all know some people that we've worked with. I mean, maybe not at Jacobin, but at least Steve and I, where we've dealt with some Trump supporters who think the Democrat is the D word of the century. So
you could say that you're like an Abraham Lincoln Republican or a Frederick Douglass Republican or something.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, you mentioned what some people have called the realignment strategy as opposed to the dirty break. Just for our listeners, in case hopefully they're following, but dirty break is use the Democrats and eventually break off from them. Realignment is eventually we'll just make the Democrats a socialist party or a leftist party. And I guess that's my question to you. I mean, it sounds like your approach is practical and not dogmatic. So if we actually got to a point where we, like in Nevada, we actually are having a lot of success taking over the Democratic Party within its internal structures as on the left. And so we have the Left Caucus here, we have the DSA, we have multiple organizations that are putting people in a majority position in the Democrats. So it almost like, to me, seems like, well, there might be some jurisdictions where we literally could just take over the Democratic Party and then, well, the centrist Democrats are gone and it's just us versus the Republicans. I mean, I guess in that scenario, is there still a problem with running as a Democrat if that's the situation? Or would you kind of say, well, maybe then realignment makes sense?
Yeah, I'm not too dogmatic on this question. I would applaud the kind of efforts that you're talking about. The one thing I would say about them is that just people should be aware that it's very likely that they will eventually, like Nancy Pelosi is not going to just leave the door open for you to totally take over the party, right? Like eventually the structural forces in the party are going to push back. Right. Maybe you can do it on a statewide level or whatever, but you're not going to just be able to waltz your way into totally reshaping the party. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that kind of stuff. In fact, the whole point of the dirty break strategy is that, like, in engaging in the kind of organizing that you're talking about, that heightens those contradictions.
Right.
But we just have to be sober about it and recognize that, as I said, they're not going to let you just they're not going to give up the party without a fight.
I think that's right.
Right. Yeah. And I guess that kind of, I know just talking with other people about this too, it's kind of, I don't know if you have a better answer than I could ever give these people, but for I guess critics of the dirty break of, like, how do you get these people elected and then have them stick true to not, I guess, just softening their views? Because I think we've seen that so many times with a lot of these progressives, quote unquote, who come into office and then they just kind of focus on one issue for the rest of their career and they kind of just vote with the party for the rest of it. Do you have any ideas on, like, how to stop that per se?
Yes, and I should have mentioned this in my explaining of the strategy, because it's not enough in politics of any kind, whether it's electoral politics or union organizing or whatever. It's never enough to just have people who you think are, like, uniquely valorous and strong and good as individual moral people. Like, you need structural, like, okay, for example, if you're going to be running people, like, we don't want to just run people who think the Democrats are bad and want to fight them. We also need people who are accountable to what Seth Ackerman would call a sort of an organization that is a bit more like a real party, like DSA, for example. So we want our own people to be running for office. We want people who have whose politics were shaped through DSA and through socialism, who feel a real sense of fealty towards DSA, who, if they were to sell those politics out, would feel really bad that they had let all their comrades down, or who can call on, DSA members to back them up when they're under attack for bucking what the mainstream Democratic Party consensus is. We have that's a key task of building the DSA is creating that kind of party-like organization that people have some level of fealty to, that has, like, a basic political program, right? Like, DSA, we don't have any kind of formal mechanisms of this as far as I know, but if you were somebody who ran as a DSA candidate for office and then all of a sudden you decided that you weren't going to back Medicare for all anymore, like, DSA members would be livid. Like, they would target, you would become the next target. You would get bird dogged wherever you went, and rightfully so, right? Like, so it's important to create those kind of structures that make newly elected left officials feel they feel accountable to, and that also that those elected officials can call on if they need them in a time of trial, because, as I said before, like, the neoliberal elements of the party are going to push back, and you can't overcome them just through your own uniquely valorous conduct. You need you need a movement behind you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point. And that's one thing that I've really realized this year, partly by reading your book and listening to a lot of people talk about this, is that, like, I care a lot less about what you say your platform is, right? Like a lot of people are excited or not excited about Joe Biden's platform, for example. That matters to me a lot less than who you owe your job to, which is what you're saying. Like, if you feel like I will not be reelected unless I do X, that's way more important to me than what you promised me you were going to do to get in office in the first place. So like Joe Biden could say whatever he wants in his platform. We all know his campaign is bankrolled by corporations. And so while he's still, and we talked about at the beginning of this call, while he's still better than Trump, who's being supported by far-right radical extremists, the reality is, yes, I agree with you completely. Building a movement going forward requires us, anyone we put in office that we actually support, they need to I think that's why it's important you don't take super PAC money. That's why it's important you don't you're not in wine cellars or wine caves or whatever Buttigieg called it, right? Because those people will then feel obligated to, give back to the corporate power that put them in office in the first place. So I think that's a really important litmus test. People don't understand, with Elizabeth Warren saying, why would we give up super PACs if the Republicans aren't doing it? We need mutual disarmament. And the whole point is because as long as you are taking money from the same goddamn people, then you're going to rule in the same way when you become queen or whatever she wanted to be. So Decatur, we're coming up on an hour here. I wanted to know if you had any other questions.
Well, I mean, I guess I should ask the obligatory question that you don't have to answer if you don't feel comfortable, but we have been forcing every guest to answer this question.
Or we boo you.
You can't set it up that way, and then I'm like, yeah, you know what? I choose to be a coward.
That's why we set it up that way. Yeah, exactly.
Shaming is the best tool that we have available to us. We are curious. I'm curious what you think is going to happen election week. Who you think is going to come out victor, if we even have it in a week per se, or 2 weeks, whatever. If you have a thought, if we get you on record on who you think is going to win it,
and we'll shame you if you get the wrong answer.
Yeah. Well. I mean, it's very hard. Anytime you say what I'm about to say, you have flashbacks to 2016, and then you're realize how wrong you were in 2016. At least you were in good company. It was everybody else was wrong about 2016,
right.
Including Trump himself. I don't think Trump actually.
I know he did not think he was going to win. Yeah.
So I guess I'm in good and bad company in that sense. But the polls all suggest that Biden is very much up. I think that the cherry on the top of the Trump 4 years, that what is his getting COVID, is something that we all laugh about it because it's just so absurd. But I think average Americans are looking at that, and the polls also indicate this, by the way. They look at what he's done and they're like, this is insane. I mean, this guy, the White House is now a super spreader site, right? This is what's going on. This is what's happened at this point. So I think people are rightfully disgusted. They said that they were just gonna, especially when given the alternative of running against somebody like Hillary Clinton, who was so widely despised, rightfully for the most part, by so many people. They were like, well, let's just see what happens with this whole Trump thing. And they've seen what happened and they're aghast. So I think my prediction is that Biden will win. Of course, the way that there are many ways that might not happen, and all of them are related to our uniquely undemocratic, anti-majoritarian political system. I mean, the whole in what world does it make sense that Trump lost by millions of votes in 2016, and yet he became the president, right? Yeah. I hate to sound like an MSNBC host or something, but it's true. We should be aghast at this. We should be we should be talking all the time about how we live in this uniquely undemocratic system that produces these kinds of outcomes. And by the way, it makes it very hard to ever win real left-wing politics when we're up against these systems where we have, systems like the Senate and systems like the Electoral College that frustrate the will of the majority.
Yeah, right. I mean, we might have a real situation where, even by the corrupt rules that we have, Biden might actually win if all the votes are counted, which they might not be counted. Like that's a real fear too, because the polls are showing that he'll win if all the mail-in ballots are counted. But he
Which
might
I mean,
not win.
I worry that, as just anyone not voting for Trump is kind of accepted. Like that's just a normal, and that could happen. It's just maybe the votes won't get counted, and we better win by a lot, which is pretty crazy. But
yeah. So there are a million horror scenarios that could produce a Trump victory despite everything. But I think that Trump will that Biden will pull it out. But we also should be, as I was saying before, that socialists should be really at the forefront of defending what little democracy we do have in this country and fighting to expand. I mean, that's what democratic socialism is all about, right? It's about expanding democracy, both where it exists, deepening it, and where it doesn't exist, pushing democracy into those realms. And so we really have to be at the forefront of those fights. We have to be on the streets if Trump does try to steal this election. We published something the other day in Jacobin by Jane McAlevey, the labor thinker and author. And in her first book, Raising Expectations and Raising Hell, the intro is about how she was sent to Florida in 2000 to help with the recount that was happening there when the Republicans stole the election. And she describes how the Democrats were like, oh, well, we're just going to trust the process, and we're going to sort of be, we're going to be quiet. We're not going to be doing things like organizing rowdy street rallies. And then, of course, the right had no scruples about organizing such things, and it delivered them the election because they were willing to like flip tables in recount centers in Miami-Dade County. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court gave Gore the election, or gave George Bush the election. I can't keep all these odious people.
They're all
they all start to blend at some point. So
that we could very much, very likely find ourselves in a similar scenario, and socialists should be ready to push back, not because we have any like real hope for Biden as a figure who's going to deliver us the things that we all know that we need, like Medicare for all and a Green New Deal, but because for the reasons we already went over, that progress is pretty much impossible under Trump, and so that could very well be in the cards, and we should be ready for it.
Here's the very last question. So you're an editor, deputy editor at Jacobin magazine, great magazine. I'll drop a link in the description. If you're not subscribed already, you should be subscribed. I am a subscriber, and it's a great magazine. I'm also a subscriber of Current Affairs, and we had Nathan Robinson on here a few weeks ago. And so my question for you is, have you been planning any kind of heist to destroy Current Affairs? What is your strategy to wipe them off the map?
Well, I should have some funny quip here to respond to that with, but the truth is that we love Current Affairs. We have all worked very hard to see Current Affairs flourish. Bhaskar Sankara, the founder of Jacobin, has spent a lot of time helping Nathan, which Nathan writes about in his book, Why You Should Be a Socialist. Funnily enough, his book begins and ends with praise for Jacobin, and so we're huge fans of Current Affairs. I believe that we should let 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of left publications. I'm a big fan of what they're up to over there. I did challenge Nathan to a bit of a duel recently.
Yes,
Nathan is very insistent on rejecting Marxism, which is something that we reject his rejection of Marxism. He apparently has a book coming out about Marx, which is good because Nathan can't stop writing books. They just sort of like flow out of him in his sleep. We'll get the clash of the titans that you're hoping for at some point, I think, once that book comes out. But we view them as comrades, of course, and we're very glad to see them flourish. And I'm very glad that Nathan is as productive as he is. I think I've read 4 of his books at this point. I don't know how he finds time to do it. I'm very envious of him.
I mean, even if you just look at his articles, they're long. I mean, I have no idea how he does. I've published exactly 1 article in my life, and it took me forever to write, and it was
torture,
not long.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So
I've written 2 books, and it's still torture to get anything out of my fingers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm
Also,
satisfied.
very Marx of you to challenge him to a duel, as you know.
Yeah, so
I'm
hopefully
a
we
strong
can-
believer in, like leftist working class politics, and that is why I'm taking the 17th century French, or whatever, Burr. It's going to be like a Burr Hamilton duel or whatever.
I think that is the best way. Yeah. I mean, we really need just one magazine on the left, right? We all agree on that. I'm just kidding. But that is the best way to settle it. We just need a duel. So I look forward to that. That's definitely going to happen. And I'll drop the link, in the description of this episode to Bigger Than Bernie, which I think everyone should read. A really, really good book. It's just very practical on how do we make democratic socialism a reality? And then also your book about the Chicago Teachers Union. I'll drop that link in the description too, because that sounds like a great book that I look forward to reading. So thank you so much for coming on the show. It was so fun talking to you. A really great conversation. Hope to have you on again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye now. Whoa, what a great interview.
Whoa!
Thanks again. Yeah, ba-boom. Thanks again, Micah, for coming on the show. Really, really enjoyed talking to you. What's your takeaway? What do we do?
What we do, we vote for Biden first off.
Yeah.
And then we get to complain about Biden for 4 years, which actually I do think something that I didn't bring up that I haven't brought up really in general in these past few weeks that we've talked about.
Time.
I am Joe Biden's vice president pick. No, I think it's actually more beneficial for growing the left if Joe Biden gets in there and people still complain about the system, and then he gets voted out in 4 years, or even ran against from a candidate on the left, like in the Democratic Party. I think that's way more valuable than having another 4 years of Trump to grow the left. Like that to me doesn't even make sense. Not even just from the stomping out that Trump would do of leftists and socialists, as Micah was talking about.
Yeah.
But just even the concept of I think, for example, if Hillary Clinton would have won, yeah, I agree. In some parts, the left wouldn't have mobilized as much, but I do think a lot of them would have been like, hey, our lives are still shitty under a Democratic president. And I think that could really happen here if we go another 4 years. So I think that's a big thing.
Dude, I honestly agree, because it's so obvious that Republicans represent values that no one on the left supports. But what is not so obvious to a lot of people is exactly what you're saying, is that Democrats actually represent pretty much the same values. And so to elect a Republican does nothing to prove our point. But to elect a Democrat and then life still sucks does everything to prove our point.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think that that's the first step, is
agreed,
voting in a man who possibly has dementia. And then I think the second step from there is, I think the dirty break is the way to go. I want to prove him wrong and run as a GOP member.
I was so excited you asked him about that idea. We need to start running leftists as Republicans, just as the ultimate heist. They'll never see it coming. So let's just start doing it. We'll do it, man. Who cares what Micah says on the issue?
We just keep talking about Abraham Lincoln. Marx wrote him. It's it's already there.
We're the Abraham Lincoln Republicans. Yeah, let's do it, man. Let's do it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Ronald Marx.
Yeah. So I mean, what else? So one of the, just to summarize kind of my takeaway on the dirty break strategy is it's like this. Whatever your thoughts on, I've heard a lot of people on the left say running as Democrats is a waste of time because the Democrats are corrupt and you're going to be corrupted if you join their party. I spoke like a New Yorker. If you join the party.
You join the party, then you join the party.
Yeah, right. I have a guy join the party. But anyway.
Oh, John from 88th Avenue? Oh, yeah. We used to have crazy times.
Oh, shit. I can't be held responsible for my words. I had an IPA.
I was going to say, you kind of, when the way you said it, you kind of sounded like the SpongeBob episode where she's like, chocolate.
Chocolate! Chocolate! Chocolate!
That's what you sounded like.
But anyway, but the point is this, it's whatever your ultimate goal is, right? Whatever it is, if it's fucking armed revolution, which I'm morally against, but let's say that is, I mean, there's situations always in human history where armed revolutions are genuinely needed, like in the one we had in this country. But like, putting that aside, the morality, like even if that is your ultimate goal, or if your ultimate goal is to take over the Democratic Party and just make it more left, like, you know, AOC and Bernie were trying to do, or if your goal is the dirty break strategy, guess what all of these plans have in common? You need a fucking mass movement of people to be on your side regardless. So what I like about running people on the Democratic ticket is that in the last 100 years, it is literally the only thing anyone's tried that has gotten socialism on the fucking map. And I mean, like in a big way. Like Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician in the United States, and he calls himself a socialist. The United States has never seen that. Am I wrong? Like, that's a fact. Like, you can talk to me about third party all day, and I am fucking down for a third party. We need a third party, but what we don't need is for leftists to be fucking obscure, and for democratic socialists to be irrelevant.
The closest thing we've ever seen is the Jesse Jackson campaign, and obviously that didn't take off in the same way the Bernie Sanders one did. So yeah, I think that, listen, we know who is behind the movement at this point. Yes, Bernie's not the only contributing factor to why the left grew, but he's definitely a main reason. And at least, we have set in place, we have the squad. They're obviously pushing a lot. Justice Democrats are still doing a lot of things. New York, it looks like they're getting a lot of more progressives in there. So now the fact is to get that party enough where we could do a dirty break. So we're definitely, I'm convinced is what I'm trying to say.
No, I'm convinced too. I hope that we get to a point where we have I do agree with a comment you made during the interview, which is like one of the problems with a third party strategy, whether it's now or later, is if at some point we're going to have to confront the question of, well, aren't we just going to split the vote on the left or, on the liberal left or whatever you want to call it, just not conservative vote.
Sure.
But that's why I think what we need to do, what we need to be advocating for first and foremost, continue to advocate for socialism. Absolutely.
Right.
Or social democracy or whatever the fuck you're down for. I don't care at this point because we're so far from any of that. But what we need to do first and foremost is advocate for democracy, like an actual democracy where, there's not this bullshit like winner takes all electoral college where like the vote is actually, a little bit more Republican, but now Republicans get the full electoral college vote of the state. Like that's ridiculous, right? That does not represent us at all. And then we need ranked choice voting. So if I do vote for Green Party, my vote doesn't get thrown away in terms of like, if Green Party does not meet the threshold of being a viable one of the top two parties, then my vote would fall back onto the Democratic Party in a ranked choice voting system. It becomes impossible to waste your vote. And in a system like that, a third party could be a actual contender to win because people would not be afraid to vote for them. So these are the things.
And just a heads up, I did see an article today that Alaska and Massachusetts are possibly considering ranked choice voting now. So
yeah. And this is something we need to do at a state level first because a national constitutional amendment is like a far cry. So the process, there's an organization called Represent Us I've mentioned before on the show, and they're doing this kind of thing where they're going state by state and using people's referendums, bypassing the power structure that exists altogether. So they're not going and begging their legislatures like, hey, please try to, give up your power, right? Because that's futile. What they're doing is they're going directly to the people with people's referendums, exploiting the few rights we do have as people in this democracy to make change. And they're actually trying to change the very way we select our leaders. And that's the answer, in my opinion. We need to do that. And then we need to simultaneously be building a movement. So when we both have ranked choice voting and the electoral college abolition and all this other shit and all that happens and all that falls into place, then we can literally just use our now improved democratic system to have a fucking social democracy or a democratic socialist state or whatever the fuck you want. I know that there's a lot of naive shit that it sounded like I just said because there's going to be a huge pushback from the capitalist class.
Well, listen, yeah. And we also have to be real. Where we are right now, as we fight for healthcare, Dianne Feinstein is 87 years old and hugging Lindsey Graham during the Supreme Court hearing. Like that's where we're at. logistically.
Yeah. Realistically, we're far from anything I just said, and it's not like they're not going to notice what we're trying to do, right? So like these steps that we're trying to take will come with fierce resistance at every step. And so I know that, and actually, again, I'll reference the Bigger Than Bernie book. They, in a very sober way, confront that. And they're like, one of the big things that you've seen in countries that did go down this path of trying to use socialism through the democratic process is one of the main problems they ran into is they faced a choice. Their leadership faced the choice of either they start to retreat from their socialism as they start to get pushback, or they stand their ground and they, in a way that they know will piss off the capitalists and the powerful people. Well, in most of the examples, they did not stand their ground. If they did, they got killed, or if they didn't, then they eventually became irrelevant. So basically the book is not unaware, Micah and Megan Day are not unaware that like there will be fierce, if not violent, resistance to any attempt to change the country. So that's why I'm not trying to tell you I don't think that like there's gonna be conflict. I think there will be conflict. I'm just saying that like social justice and economic justice and getting people out from under this fucking thumb of the powerful is important.
And I think a better way to look at it is like simply, if there's no conflict, like if it just happened, then it would have been done. Like clearly.
Oh yeah.
Clearly you're not making real change if there's not any pushback. So, I mean, that's definitely to be expected. The first stuff though is, I mean, just getting out these, these old capitalist Democrats. Yeah. We'll see what happens with this Pelosi race. Do I think Shahid Buttigieg is going to win? No, but I think that we're finally making the steps, and I could see this being a strategy, a 20-year plan, maybe that really could pay off.
Yeah, I mean, and like my final thoughts on this is like one of the most important ways we can set ourselves up for that conflict that will inevitably happen as we try to improve our country is give ourselves some real power. And one of those ways is to unionize the fuck out of this country. We need to bring that back. And I know there's a lot of unions, but there's nothing compared to the union movement we used to have in this country. And a union is not just simply to improve your workplace or to make more money or to get better benefits. That's a huge part of it. And that's the number one reason most people do. But another reason to unionize is we need to give the working class power around the entire country.
And just from a propaganda state of view here is, that seems to be the one thing that the Republicans and, some Democrats have not been able to tarnish is the reputation of unions. I know some of the most conservative guys who are still part of unions. Like they wouldn't throw that shit away. They'll vote for Trump, and it's obviously idiotic to vote for the GOP if you're in a union. But they'll do it, and it's been something the GOP's tried to get rid of, but they can't slash it completely. So I think we need to use that leverage that unions have. Because that's kind of from a propaganda state of affairs.
No, I mean, I had this conversation earlier today with someone else. Is that that's exactly the point? Is socialists, their reputation has been destroyed. Absolutely fucking ruined. And we're doing very, very slow and difficult work to bring it back to realize oh no, this is a really proud international tradition of people just trying to improve our society for everybody. They don't want anyone to suffer. It's not we want the rich to go die in a corner. Some people do, and whatever. But the idea is we won't have class. We will all be in this shit together. That's the idea of socialism. But that's been fucking tarnished beyond belief. If you try to go around telling people you're a socialist, 80% of people will tell you to go fuck yourself. Unions don't have that problem. Unions are, they do have some stigma to them, especially the more corrupt unions that are out there. We talked about the culinary union, turning on Bernie and that kind of shit. No one likes them except for the people in them. But but unions are still respected because they do wield actual power. Right. In multiple ways. They can stand up directly to the bosses. They can stand up directly to the politicians. They actually wield real power in a way that political organizations envy. And so we need more people to be in unions so we can actually stand together when we need to. No, totally. So yeah, guys, thank you once again for listening to this episode, and keep in mind, we have a Patreon that you could be a member for as low as $1 a month. That's that's the Dollar Shave Club, but better because you don't have to shave.
And for that $1, you get to help this dog eat food.
He's showing his cutest dog on camera right now, and it's the best. All right. Any last thoughts?
I love you, and follow us on our Twitter. That's also below, because we look like losers.
We have not promoted our Twitter at all, so please go follow it. It's at Steve and Decatur. Again, that's at Steve and Decatur. All right, later.